So you can see here we've now got a fresh file that we can begin to customize, and we'll begin by taking out some of these basic things. So now we have a very clean outline that'll allow us to do some new coding. And the big subject that we want to talk about, and I'll just put a few comments right here. Let's start using objects in our JavaScript. Now, one of the important features of objects is that, one, objects store data. They're also capable of doing functions. So all in all, objects are smart and capable. And they also can represent real-world things. So we can model our applications using our objects. So they're all quite useful to us. So let's get started in doing some of that. And you'll see this idea of objects really come back to benefit you as we go more into the cloud, as we draw more data down from the database. And we're thinking more about our object maybe equaling a package of sorts. You know, our object is going to equal kind of a package that crosses the internet. And so as the weeks go by, we'll kind of paint that picture. And let me just say this, by the time that you guys get into doing the cloud, your understanding of objects are going to be so good that you'll see everything in terms of making objects for everything. Not very differently than the way that you've been learning Java up to this point. So let's go ahead and set up a very simple paragraph. And let's continue to use this kind of demo. And I'll close our p tag. And then inside of our script, we're just going to do something very simple. We're going to say we have a person, and that person is going to be structured so that they have a first name, they're going to have a last name, they're going to have an age, and they'll have an integer for that age, and they'll have an eye color, which is going to be a blue. And then that prototype gets finished with okay. So we know that that is a given object. Let's go here and say, well, let's go ahead and get element by ID. And let's go ahead, grab the demo, acquire the demo, and then say that within that, we're going to format some of that object's properties by saying, well, print into demo the person's first name. And yours may not autocomplete, it may. Xcode is what I'm using, which tends to do as much auto-completion as it can. And then we'll print its last name. And that'll be the end of the script. Save a little bit of room there. So that we'll let that stand for a sec. And if we like, we can make this neater so it becomes extremely easy to read. But you can see some of our building blocks. we have, our identified HTML element within our HTML DOM. We've got a variable which really acts as an object, which has an enumeration of values. And then we're going to go ahead and populate the markup with attributes from within that object. So let's go ahead and run that. Let's see if we have a good. So it looks pretty simple. I mean, if you all if you guys are doing a page where you've got just a little bit of output, that's okay. But if you do inspect element, people will respect that there was some pretty sweet stuff that was happening behind the scenes. Now, John Doe, that's not much happening there, but really we've taken the contents of an object and we've liquidated those contents in a very nice presentation. Now, also what's interesting here, and you can see this if I can zoom in here a little bit, there's actually this $0, there's a variable associated with this paragraph. So JavaScript actually went ahead and calculated this value and then placed it within this this paragraph right here. Now you've seen that I've used the console very quickly to type in. We have a variable here named person, and so when I've typed person into the console, the browser is aware of there being 4 values associated with the person, i.e. the person's first name, their age, and their eye color. So what we're saying here is that a series of values is accessible, and then if we go person dot first name, those values are now available to the rest of the page. So that's pretty good stuff. So I'm going to kind of keep moving a little bit, and I'm going to make a second sample just so we make the video a little faster. And you guys should feel, enfranchised to slow it down as you see fit. And let's economize and get right into our example. We'll keep our demo up here. Why don't we call that test? And we'll set up a different kind of outcome. And just so we can show off a little bit, we'll say within our script, instead of setting up var person equals, instead we're going to say create a function called person. And within that, there's going to be a couple of arguments: a first, a last name, an age, and then an eye color. And then we'll set up. I really like it when brackets look like this. I know it's very common for folks to go like this. There's something, as someone who learned programming in the 80s and literally went to computer camp as a young person, there's something, I don't know if that's cool to do anymore. Probably your children will go to computer camp. You'll have little nerd children. But my parents, they allowed me to go to computer camp, and they were thinking, is that a healthy thing to do? It's not outdoors. It's all air conditioning. Should our child be doing that? Well, so. But that's the way that programming worked in the 80s. And it's really funny as you go back to the iPhone, whose language was developed in the 80s. Programming in the iPhone is a trip back to the 80s. You put on your Vans, and you put on, some breakdancing music, and then you start coding for iPhone. And it's a trip back to the 80s. And everything there has that 80s feel to it. So I was successful with the iPhone. But that's a little different than the way people do things. But I like it. It's easy to read. So let's say that my first name gets initialized with that value of first. And then I have a new member value called last name, kind of similar, and that's going to become last. Now, this keyword means that whenever you make a new instance of a person, you have a first name and a last name that's immediately accessible. And it's a little bit of the way that we do Java, because JavaScript mimics Java. And let's say that we have an eye color, which is I. I think you're getting the... so let's say I have a variable called my father who's going to operate as a new person with a name and an age that we want to look like an integer, so we don't place quotes around something that we want to have algebraic value. So we want for us to be able to do math on it, so we don't put quotes around it. We don't want for JavaScript to interpret it as a string. And let's say we have a new person as well who's going to have a name. And then we'll try to leverage the values that we've created here. Get element by ID, which you're going to get very good, and that's going to end up in the test. And we'll set the inner HTML of that. And you're going to get very good at typing that very fast. And we'll say what adds. And we'll say, well, let's take my father's age. And we'll kind of concatenate the age value toward, and that will be the end of the script. Now again, we're just doing something a little bit different. We're initializing, we're constructing a person here, or an object of type person. Then we instantiate that person, and we populate it with these startup values. And let's go on up. I know you're copying and doing all that. Let's go ahead and test this. And you can see that things are working nicely. Whenever you guys are building up an application, you should start with very simple code that ends up doing something. And then you should stage more complex operations upon that code until it begins to have richness. So what we're doing here is what you should be doing to construct something interesting. So you should probably begin your web page by just doing some JavaScript. And that JavaScript is going to be is going to contain an object. And the object is going to contain some attributes. And so this has the ability to store some data, has the ability to initialize that object, and then we can use that later. Very good. So let's do a fresh version. I'm sorry if you're following along and you're trying hard to do this. I suppose I could keep this here a little bit longer, but you guys can probably pause the video. But you're getting the basic idea. So let's go ahead and create a third sample. And let's create a member function within an object. Okay. So we'll keep our paragraph up top here, and then we'll go back to the way we initially made our object, where we'll say we have a person, and we'll create a simple prototype where they have a first name. And they have a last name, which is equal to. And why don't we just give it a real And let me replace this with the object assignment operator. And we'll say for the full name, why don't we run a function which returns the concatenated version of the first name plus a space plus the last name, okay, end bracket for the function. So this bracket belongs to the function right here. And we'll say that that's the end of that prototype. And then we'll say, look, within the document, grab the test element. Okay, and I'm intentionally going fast just to keep your attention. I'm not encouraging you to go fast though. But what I want to do next is I actually want to run the member function in the object. Remember the full name object that we ran right here? Whenever we ask for the full name of that person, we're going to run the following code. Isn't that cool? So you can kind of inline that function. Now I don't want to congratulate myself too fast. I want to just make sure that I'm giving you code that is working. And you see the moment I do a video, I run up the inspect element. That looks pretty good. So naturally something is printing, and I can say, well, what is that person looking like? And that console is going to help me, declare what's been encoded within that. If I want to run the full name, they'll also deliver that and tell us what's in there. My bad. Go ahead and execute. And so that we can execute that function from within the console as well. And you can see that console helps us. We can show off. What I find is that I just go ahead and do the get element by ID. And if I see things are working on the page, I'm happy. But sometimes I actually want to interpolate within the object and say, well, what is the person's ID? And that helps me to check that my data is moving back and forth. So what if you got all this data from the cloud, from a database query, which you'll know how to do in a little while? What if you're getting that from a foreign source? Maybe you want to investigate the object to see that the object is bearing fruit and that it will give us information. That's all a good thing. But I think you can see how nicely that function is running from within that object. So you get a very good example of how to do that. Okay, so we'll put this up there just to get you guys started. There are other ways of doing functions within an object. We actually can include a function just at the very end of the prototype declaration. And so I may do a quick additional movie to get that up there. And maybe instead of that, why don't we just kind of give you an example right here. You see how I went ahead and I made my person, and then I said, well, whenever you want to get this attribute, go ahead and attach a function to it and complete this function right here. So if you run that function and you supply some input, it will take that input and then render some result. So that's an alternative that you guys can try for this week's micro project. And inside of our first example, I gave you a quick example of how I can add an additional attribute to an object within the space of the script, and then you can access that additional attribute here. So all over and over, very fun, very fluid. It's totally there for you to learn. It's absolutely a tool that's there for you. Don't count out being a developer just yet. Just try it. I'm sure you'll be a success at it. Give it a try. All right. YouTube, over and out.